today's video, I'm going to share with you my favorite books that I read this year in 2024. Now, this isn't a all my favorite books, so something like that, all time, top 5. This is just some books that I read this year that I have found really interesting. Some of them are rereads. I do that a lot. I'll go back through my library and kind of take a look at what I got and maybe revisit a book that I really found interesting that I've read before. And I did some of that this year. Normally, I read about 30 to 40 books a year, but this year I kind of slacked a little bit. I read more probably around 20 to 25 books, which is a little low for me. As some of you may know me, I do read a lot, but and of course, some of you might be thinking, man, 25 books, that's insane. I haven't read that much in my lifetime, but I'm a reader. I love reading. I love learning. And so I just wanted to share with you some of my favorite books that I read this past year. And so here, let's take a look. So the first book that I want to share with you is this book right here called Your Money or Your Life. Now, this book actually is an older book. It was originally first published in, I believe, in 1992. And then it was revised, revisited, and then it was, updated to basically today's, lingo, so to speak, with new examples. Kind of makes it more modern. And what I love about this book, there's two big things. I mean, it talks about how our relationship with money, really should change, and how our relationship with work should change. And there's two things that I pulled from this. One is that when we think about money, we should think about it in the way of how much time do I have to spend to exchange, basically exchange my time for the money that I'm about to spend. So say you make $20 an hour and you're going to go out to eat and you have to spend $10 on that meal at Chick-fil-A. Well, that's going to cost you 30 minutes of your life. And so that's kind of the idea. One of the main points in this book is that we're exchanging, when you go to work, you're exchanging your time for money. That's what we do in today's society, in today's day and age. And so that was one of the big things. The other big point that I got out of this was how to separate work from your wage. Now, how they define, Vicki Robin and Joe Dominguez are the authors of this book, and how they defined essentially work is the purpose, your life's purpose, what you feel God has laid on your heart to go and do. And maybe that's to be a teacher, maybe that's to be a counselor, maybe it's to be a graphic designer, whatever it is, God has laid that on your heart. And so that is the work that you do. That is the type of basically thing you set out to do. Now, some people get to do both. They get to be a teacher. That is their work. And they also get to have their wage. Now, the wage is what you do for hourly. So say, for example, you say, I'm a teacher, but I have chosen to be in computer science, say for my wage. So that is one way that they separate work from wage. And it's very helpful. It's very useful because, for someone like me that I really have struggled throughout the years of self-identifying what I do for work is basically my purpose. And what they're saying in this book is, no, don't do that. Don't live like, the job that you do defines who you are. And that's a very biblical statement, obviously, because if we are believers in Jesus Christ, well, I'm a follower of God. I'm a disciple of God. I'm a follower of Christ. I do and obey him. That's who I am. I'm not defined by what I do for work. And so this book was really helpful. I read a lot of books on finance this year, and this one stood out to me the most. So pick this book up. The second book that I recommend is this book called Living Life Backward by David Gibson. Now, this book is essentially a commentary on the book of Ecclesiastes, and to basically summarize this book is he takes the book of Ecclesiastes and puts it into a real world life application of how we should live our life. And I love it because this is actually a reread. I read this last year and I read it again this year. And there are so many notes and annotations in this book that I would let people borrow it, but they would probably end up reading my notes and my underlines more than they actually read the book. But it's amazing how he looks at how life really, we should really look at life from the end. So when we think about, he essentially says, think about going to your graveside and looking back, right? And that's the whole point of living life backwards. Because if you've read the book of Ecclesiastes, you'll know that Solomon, who wrote the book, is talking about how everything's vanity. He's had all the money, he's had all the fame, he's had all the relationships, he's had everything, and nothing seemed to satisfy. And so in this book, David Gibson is trying to point us to the fact that nothing in this world is going to give us the joy and satisfaction that can only come from God. And that is a truth that I've been trying to live out since I've read this book. And it's very difficult because we think about the here and the now, but we don't think about the future. And so when we think about our life and the things that we're trying to do, things that we're trying to accomplish, even doing this, this video for YouTube, I mean, who knows, in 50 years, YouTube may not even exist. And so, even though I find joy in doing these things now, I shouldn't allow these things to define, one, who I am, but also to live by them. And so that is what's important about this book, Living Life Backwards, is to basically to live with the end in mind. When people look at my obituary, what is it going to say? Is it going to say I was a big enjoyer of things in this world, or is my life, my obituary going to say, he was a follower of Christ? And so that's something that, you should ask yourself, because this is a great book. I would recommend you pick this up. It's really going to make you think and really, allow you to see the world differently. So Living Life Backward by David Gibson, pick it up. Now, this next book on my list is called The Storied Life by Jared C. Wilson. Jared C. Wilson, he's a pastor and author. I've been following him for years, and he is one of my favorite Christian writers. I pretty much have all the books that he's written. And in this book, he basically wrote a book about Christian writing. Now, I've said before, I'm trying to be I'm an aspiring writer. I wish I was more consistent at it, and I wish I had a lot more to say. But this book, essentially, he breaks down writing from a Christian perspective and how writing is an act of worship and how writing is a way for people who enjoy writing, how they can look at their writing as a way to honor and glorify God. And that's basically what he talks about in the first part of the book. The second part of the book, he goes into more detail about, what makes good writing, some habits, some tidbits, things like that to help improve your writing. I would recommend this book for someone who is struggling with their writing career and trying to look at it from a Christian perspective. This book does a good job at talking about some of the tips and things to be a better writer. But I would go to other resources if you wanted to learn more about grammar and punctuation, maybe some things about passive versus active verbs and things like that. But if you're looking for a book that talks about writing that's easy to read and enjoy to read, pick up The Storied Life by Jared C. Wilson and check out some of his other books too. The Imperfect Disciple is one of my favorites. There are several that he did with Matt Chandler back in the early 2010s, and some of those books are really good. So check out Jared C. Wilson. Couldn't recommend him enough. Now, this next book on my list is called The Devoted Mind by Chris Lundgaard. Now, I actually just reread this book. This is another reread for me. I read this about a year ago, and I just reread this book, finished it about a week ago. And man, I am so blown away by this series of books. There's 3 of them: The Devoted Mind, The Glorious Christ, and then, it's back here on my shelf, The Enemy Within. That's what it's called. Now, what Chris Lundgaard did, he took a book, a treatise, or an essay, whatever you want to call it, by John Owen called Spiritual Mindedness, and he basically stripped it down, broke it down to simple terms, and kind of rewrote it, so to speak. And that's all 3 of these books. That's what he's done. He took a work from John Owen and basically not made it better, but made it more readable for the 21st century. And essentially in this book, he talks about how as Christians, we need to have our minds devoted on God always. And that can be difficult to do, especially in a day and age of distraction and, our minds, our hearts being pulled away to other things, that we tend to lose our sense of joy and pleasure from God himself. And I love this book for that reason, because it really makes you think, as a Christian, am I doing my devotions for me, or am I doing my devotions for God? Am I having a time of meditation where I'm meditating on God, meditating on God's word, or am I just reading it just to do it? And that is, and this goes in all aspects of our lives, whether it be in our quiet times, whether it be in our family times, devotions, worship. I mean, something that he talks about in this book is how we approach worship and how we should be delighted in the mind of God and delighted and devoted to God through our minds. And that is an act of worship as well. And so, again, this is a great book. I love John Owen. I've read several of his books, and he just blows me away. But if you're looking into reading some of the Puritans and you're kind of scared of like the old English language or the kind of the redundancy that you see a lot of times in Puritan works, pick up this series by Chris Lundgaard. It was originally published in 2000, but they just re-released it. 3 books: The Devoted Mind, The Enemy Within, and The Glorious Christ. So could recommend these enough. A great start to get into the Puritan works. Second to last book on my list for 2024. This book is called Mastery by Robert Greene. Now, Robert Greene, he is I guess you would kind of describe him as a self-help, philosophical kind of a dude. But he wrote this book on mastery, which basically breaks down what it takes to be a master. And he's real famous for his book, The 48 Laws of Power, which he wrote in the late 90s, early 2000s. But what I love about this book is he breaks down what does it take to be a master. You know, we see this a lot where mastery takes about 10,000 hours to work on a skill before you're considered a master. And he talks about, of course, he talks about that, but he also talks about the key, which I think is so important. The key to mastery is patience. Now, one of the things that I've recently just picked up on is art. I've never been really an artist, but I've always been kind of a creative person. So recently I started drawing, I started painting a little bit. And one of the things that, I get so frustrated with is I look online or Instagram and see people who are way better at art than I am. And so you start feeling this sense of envy, covetousness, like you just want what they have. But the reality is those people that have been doing that for a long time, they've already put in the work and the time to get to that level, that skill level, that mastery that they're trying to achieve. And so when I read this book, it got me thinking of how often when I try to master something or learn something, I don't want to wait for it. I don't want to have to have the sense of patience. I mean, anytime you try to learn a new skill, and God's going to teach you patience through that. Just, take guitar, for instance. How many of you have tried to play the guitar and quit after like 3 days, right? So there's a sense of time that it takes. And one thing I love about Robert Greene, he does this in most of his books, is that he actually uses history, like historical examples, to make his point. And so he'll use stories from like in this book, he talks about Edison, Napoleon, some other, greats some people that we haven't even heard of. And he goes through their lives and talks about some stories that kind of help make his point. So pick up this book, Mastery by Robert Greene. Another great book by his is The Laws of Human Nature. Admittedly, I haven't read all of it. I got about halfway through, and then I got bored. As often what happens when I read books, if they're really long, I'll get bored and I'll stop and I'll go back to them later. But Robert Greene, can't recommend him enough. All right, and the last of my recommendations of books that I read in 2024 is this book, this monster of a book, as you can see right here, by David McCullough, called Truman. And now this is a book that chronicles the life of Harry Truman, President of the United States, who came after Franklin Delano Roosevelt and then became before Dwight D. Eisenhower. Now, the reason I read this book, one, because I love David McCullough. He's one of my favorite historical writers, and I read pretty much everything that he's written. But I also read this book because I don't know that much about Harry Truman. I do now after reading this. But I was really, you see people talk about Harry Truman, that he's one of the unsung heroes of the American presidency, that he's not really well known or well liked, at least talked about in history books. But Harry Truman was a very interesting guy who fought in World War I. He came back, dabbled in politics a little bit, ended up becoming a senator, was real instrumental actually in limiting government waste, which I thought was pretty cool. And then when he became vice president to FDR at that time, little fun fact, I love talking about history, so I'm going to talk about this for a second. But the year that FDR got reelected in 1944, the doctors told him he basically had a year to live, but he ran for president anyway. I mean, think about the scandal that would bring today, especially after this past election. But they knew that whoever was going to be vice president was going to become president, because they knew that FDR wasn't going to live much longer. And of course, FDR did die in 1945. But Truman was a guy, he didn't want to become president. He enjoyed being a senator. He enjoyed leading the Senate and the committees that he was on. And then he got thrusted into this situation where not only did he have to make the decision to drop the atomic bomb, but he also had to make the decision to get us basically into the Cold War with the invasion of Korea. He had to fire America's beloved general, John MacArthur. He actually was in involved in some very historical moments. And he's often, like I said, overlooked because of how unpopular he was at the time, because a lot of people still didn't like the New Deal. It wasn't working. And then, of course, when Dwight D. Eisenhower came along, it was pretty much, game over after that. But, this was a really, really good read. Again, I recommend everything that David McCullough has written. Another one of his great books is called John Adams. He talks about John Adams. And again, another one of those unsung heroes of the Revolution, another president that is often overlooked. When actually John Adams, he had a sad life. It was really very, the reason, we honestly probably could make an argument that the reason we have American independence today is because of John Adams. So I recommend you pick up David McCullough's book of Truman, his book on John Adams, and many of his other great books. So that's all I got today. If there's any other books that you would recommend that you've read for 2024, drop a comment down below and hit that like button. I would love to hear what you've read this year that you've really enjoyed. I'm always looking for new books, new ideas, new things to read. I try to read broadly. And so if you wouldn't mind doing that, hit that subscribe button. I would love for you to follow along as I take you on this journey through my life, through theology, and through just the study of the world around us. So thank you guys for listening, and hope you guys have a great and wonderful week.